Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to, can you believe it, episode 16 of our, what started out to be a COVID series, but like all great shows, we've been adapting to demand, and the demand from our audience, Craig and Donna, has been to pivot a bit and do some deeper dives into more topics. So I think we may have to rename the series, but joining me again today is Donna Berger with the Becker Law Firm. Donna, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And back by popular demand, my partner and the president of the Castle Group, Craig Vaughn, who calls himself the eye candy of this webinar series, Donna. So I'm personally a little offended by that. I also want to remind everybody, we have had quite a few requests for past episodes, and you can go to castlegroup.com and click on our COVID banner, and all of the episodes are there to look back on. And also you can go to info@castlegroup.com if you have any questions, or we started to have a few of you send us your COVID stories or other stories that we look forward to sharing in future episodes. So please, if you have a story you think the rest of our audience would benefit from, please share it with us. We've had a couple of Zoom issues today, so just a reminder, if you ever do get logged off, just log back on again. Usually that solves the problem. Poor Zoom must be inundated with just volumes beyond their comprehension. And then finally, I want to remind everybody that although Donna will fill us with brilliance again today, it's not legal advice that she's providing you. And I know you have lots of Becker clients on here, Donna, but I think you should talk to them offline as well.
I try.
Yeah, well, I was thinking billable hours. We were just joking before we came on that we've gotten a bill for an hour of Donna's time every 2 weeks here. I'm joking,
If
of
only.
course. Yeah. And then we also had some great response. I must tell the audience how helpful you have been in, first of all, doing our surveys, but also the online polling. Some of the feedback we get from this series has been how great it is for our clients and non-clients to learn what everyone else is doing. You know, sometimes as a board member, we feel very alone. And I think there's some comfort in getting the feedback from everybody else that's in the same chair. So quickly on the agenda today, we thought we'd start with a quick COVID update. And then we had a couple of questions, Donna, I wanted to do follow-up because they were so prevalent on the ESA episode we did 2 weeks ago. And then we're going to jump into hurricanes. And although it may seem a little late in the season to be doing one on hurricanes, we do get a lot of questions. And frankly, had we been doing webinars and doing it earlier, we would have done this. But COVID kind of brought this platform to us, and it dominated the first many episodes.
Do you think we're ever going to do a lighthearted subject? I'm looking at this lineup: COVID, fraudulent requests, and hurricanes.
I know how to enjoy being a board member of an association. How about that?
Something frothy in the future, but
yeah. Well, Craig, you're pretty good at comedy, so we may have to do that.
We need a little lifestyle one.
Also, this is kind of a neat episode today because it really applies across condo and HOA, and you know, even on kind of a larger scale HOA, you have possibility gates and access issues, and you have landscaping issues and pool issues and clubhouse issues, and then obviously the condominiums are even more so. And similarly, Craig, as you know, our first real threat this year was Laura last week in Texas, and we managed 2 huge communities in Houston. And so we had to go through our whole hurricane procedure, even though Florida wasn't under risk at that time. So please, one of the things that Craig really helps us out with is with your chat questions. So keep those coming, and as we stop at each section, Donna, I'm going to ask Craig to see what's coming across the board, and maybe we can do some real live answering. So with that, let's talk quickly about COVID. it looks like the numbers are coming down. That's good. It looks like a vaccine is coming closer to us. That's good. In fact, I had a call just before this episode, Craig, from a client asking if we were going to make vaccines mandatory for teammates, which is a great question. There's some legal and medical issues there, so that's for another episode. But Donna, two areas I wanted you to comment on. Number one, emergency powers. They expire shortly, and talk to us about that. And then the second one being the extension of the eviction
Sure.
moratorium.
Sure. Well, Governor DeSantis already issued an extension on the moratorium regarding landlord evictions and mortgage foreclosures. Those have now been, that moratorium has been extended until October 1st. For our listeners in Florida, it's important to remember that that does not affect association foreclosures. It would affect associations who own units and rent out their own units. They would not be able to evict tenants. But for association foreclosures, for non-payment of assessments, you can and should be moving forward on those. So that moratorium affects bank foreclosures. And to the extent that your members don't know about that, some education may be in order. With regard to the overall statewide state of emergency, that is in effect until September 6th. We're going to have to wait and see whether or not that is extended. All the numbers are certainly encouraging. I know we're all happy those are coming down. And it may be that the state of emergency is not extended, that it ends on September 6th. So what does that mean for your board? It means a couple things. We have to trace the source of authority for the decisions and actions you want to take. So speak to council, because it depends on whether or not you have active infections and whether or not you have tools in your governing documents that you can rely upon, because some boards do have emergency powers in their own documents. So this is not a, statewide state of emergency ends, everything gets flipped back to normal. That's really not the path that you should be taking. You need to look at what's going on in your community and whether or not you have emergency powers in your documents and what you want to do with that.
Donna, I think this is, I always try and stop at what I think are key takeaway points from these webinars for our board members. And this is a biggie. It is possible that the state of emergency is not extended by September 6th. And that has serious implications to how we're operating our communities. And really, you have no choice but to seek counsel on what you can and can't do, because each situation is different based on circumstance and documents and whatnot. So key takeaway number one, Don, I'm going to kind of play off that one. Can you explain to our audience what's the difference between the emergency powers that we've been operating under for the last few months and the emergency powers that would possibly be put in place if there was a hurricane? Is there a difference? And if so, what is it?
There really isn't a difference. So we have been relying on the emergency powers in Chapter 718, which is the Condominium Act, 719, which is the Cooperative Act, and 720, which is the HOA Act. We've been relying on the statutory powers that were already in place, and those were designed to assist boards grappling with the aftermath of a hurricane, okay? So we've kind of been, that's all we have right now. And if you recall, I was named as the chair of the Florida Bar's Pandemic Task Force. Our top job was to look at those statutory powers and really fold in a pandemic type of what we're dealing with now into those statutory powers. But to answer your question, it is one and the same. It's just the way you interpret it. So when a hurricane comes, and we're going to talk about this, a lot of what we've been dealing with now, we just shift and we use it and apply it in the event of a storm as opposed to a communicable disease. I did want to circle back really quickly, because I know a lot of boards are really thinking, what do we do on September 7th if the state of emergency is not extended? What your board needs to understand is, in the past, there really has not been a lot of decision making about the pool. Pools and gyms really did not present inordinate risk. Would you agree? I mean, yes, for swimming and yes, for cleaning, but other than that, it was okay, we got a pool. It's going to be open X number of days, X number of hours. Same thing with the gym. But boards are often asked to make judgment calls on, where can you walk your pet? How can you park your car? Where can you park your car? This is just a new mindset. If the state of emergency is not extended, you just need as a board to start thinking about other things related to operating your pools and your gyms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good clarification, Donna. Craig, I see some questions coming in on COVID, and I don't want to leave our COVID update without addressing those. Have a look and see if there's anything that pops, Craig. The one question we've gotten repeatedly, and I think Donna, maybe just a commentary, is because we do have different areas of the state coming into phase 2 that weren't and whatnot. And we always get the question, if my county goes to the next phase, do I have to? Comment?
The answer is no, you don't have to. If it doesn't feel right for your community, if you've got infections, if you have a vulnerable population, if you have an inability to manage your common areas in the midst of a pandemic, because the pandemic is still here and we still don't have a vaccine, right?
Yep.
So we do still have a problem. The problem is hopefully minimizing on a weekly, monthly basis, but we do still have a problem. So to answer your question, as a board, you do not need to mimic what the county or city is doing. You cannot go below what their requirements are, but you can go above them.
Mariness, this would be a good time to do poll question 1, which was our only question on COVID. And this was really to give our audience a flavor for whether we've been changing our restrictions in our communities. And Craig, while our audience is answering that poll question, is there anything you want to ask from the board COVID related? Because we're about to move to an ESA follow-up.
No, I think Donna hit the main point. The questions that have been chatted in are really, do I have phase 2? Palm Beach County goes to phase 2 because that's a specific what's going on in the news. If they go to phase 2, do I have to do anything? And I think, Donna, your comment, if I heard it right, was no, it's not going to force you to do anything. And what I'm also hearing similarly, if they don't renew emergency powers, you don't have to do anything other than be conscious of, the closing of your amenities and things like that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Craig. I mean, listen, if you're a community in Palm Beach that has food service at the pool, let's say, and you don't feel comfortable right now continuing with that food service, just because Palm Beach County has now said restaurants and let's say even bars are open up, doesn't mean you have to do that. Speak to council. But if it's not a good fit for your community, either because of your infrastructure, the way it's laid out, because of staffing issues, or because of a vulnerable population, you're not forced to mimic what the county is doing.
I think what I would say, Jane, just add a comment, would be, I think what will happen is it will increase the pressure on those boards that have amenities closed. I can already hear the vocal minority saying, well, if the bowling alley can open, surely we can open our pool. So I think there'll be increased pressure would be my guess.
Well, let's have a look at our poll results. Will you share those, please, Mariness? And interestingly here, everyone, my first observation is we've kind of fallen into this COVID fatigue going on forever, and almost like it's a new normal, a status quo. And look at the no change number there. That's not surprising. And if I were to interpret the other two, increased restrictions are probably a result of circumstances in those communities. And decreased restrictions is probably a result of either them being an area that's got lower rates or pressure from their ownership group to decrease the restrictions. So,
well, I think this reflects, James, that our boards are being cautious. They know we're still under a statewide state of emergency until September 6th. So next time we do this, depending on whether or not that's extended or it lapses, I think those numbers are going to shift. But that's encouraging. It means our board members are being cautious.
Yeah. Okay. Donna and Craig, thanks for that COVID update. We're going to move now to a couple of questions. Donna, we had some fantastic feedback from our webinar 2 weeks ago on emotional support animals. But there were two real areas where there seemed to be questions. And the first was we learned that we require a letter or other authorization from a licensed healthcare practitioner. And in the webinar, you and I used various different terms like mental health professional, nurse, doctor, medical. And as I understand it, the legislation is not that restrictive. What they're really looking for is a licensed practitioners who would never put their own license at risk for doing a fraudulent claim. But can you just maybe expand and give our audience, Donna, some clarity on the provision related to licensed healthcare practitioner?
Well, you just hit on the word. It's healthcare. So in Florida, we have a lot of professions that are highly regulated, where you need a license. I mean, I think I mentioned in our last webinar, James, that one of the letters that was submitted on behalf of somebody wanting an ESA was a person who officiates at funerals. We rejected that, okay? That person was a licensed professional. She had a license, but it wasn't to engage in mental health care. She maybe thought that because she was helping bereaved people, but it did not meet the legal requirements. So it does need to be a licensed practitioner, a healthcare practitioner. You don't necessarily need a psychiatrist writing the letter. Also, it doesn't need to be a Florida practitioner, licensed professional. It can be, elsewhere. But, and by the way, I did submit a follow-up blog, which is the 10 things you may not know about the new law. Most people know that the new law makes it a crime, a misdemeanor of the second degree, if you submit a fraudulent ESA request now. But there's a lot more meat on the bones with regard to that law. So I hope the blog kind of fleshes that out.
And how could our audience access that blog, Donna?
Well, it's you guys are going to post it as a
Yeah,
matter of fact,
we'll
but it's
post it,
also
but-
it's communityassociationlawblog.com. That's my long-standing blog, but I think you're going to put it up on the Castle page where
Yeah.
we've got information, so they can go there as well.
So Marinette, let's see if we can get a link to that so everyone has a place to get it. The second question, and Donna, thanks for doing those blogs. I mean, it really is a public service, and I know our audience is grateful for that, as are we. The second question that seemed to be fairly significant, Donna, was the relationship between an ESA and quote, quote, a pet as defined in our association documents. And so I'm going to kind of marry two questions together here. One is there a difference, or is an ESA animal a pet? And two, if I have pet restrictions in my community, let's say 2, how does that apply to an ESA?
Right. It's such a common misconception, James, that well, we have pet restrictions. If you have a pet, if you bring a pet in here, you have to pay a pet deposit. You have to pay a fee for a tag to put on the dog's collar. And in some communities, you have to pay a fee to do the DNA testing, the doggy do testing. Here's the issue. Under the eyes of the law, these ESAs and service animals are not considered pets. They are considered legally to be extensions of their disabled humans. So any kind of fee you try to put on them, and by the way, this is in the new law, you cannot require any sort of extra compensation for somebody seeking these animals, an ESA or a service animal. What happens is if you have pet restrictions that require payment of money, whether it's, I said a pet deposit, a pet fee for a tag, or DNA testing, people who don't want to pay the fee, you know what happens? Oh, this isn't my pet, this is my ESA. It's the same thing we saw with the air carriers. People for decades took and flew with their animals, but they went in cargo and they paid for it. All of a sudden they decided, well, wait, if I say this is an ESA, I don't have to pay, and Fifi can sit next to me on the seat. So it's sort of the same thing. Your board needs to decide how important is that pet deposit, because most of the animals coming in will not be charged that pet deposit because they're probably going to be coming in as ESAs. you might be better off not charging the deposit, and that might help cut down on some of the fraud.
So just we're clear, number one, an ESA is not a pet as it relates to your regulation. And two, I didn't ask this question, Donna, but I know you and I discussed it. There is not a specific law limiting the number of ESAs. Obviously, at some point, the healthcare practitioner's credibility would be stretched if it was more than one or two. But am I correct? There's no law that limits the number of ESAs?
So you're right. There is no law, but again, we have to remember accommodations need to be reasonable. The law, federal and Florida discrimination laws, do not require housing providers to make unreasonable accommodations. An unreasonable accommodation would be, I have 1,000 square foot unit and I have 3 German Shepherds in that unit. Even if you wound up getting, in my opinion, a different letter, because you will need, the new law specifies, you need different letters for each of your ESAs proving the different impaired life activities that particular dog will be providing. Even with that, I would make the argument that it's not going to be reasonable to have 3 of them in 1,000 square foot unit. So a lot of this requires a conversation with experienced counsel about where you can push the boundaries and where you shouldn't.
Interesting. Greg, we're going to move to Donna. Thank you. I think that's very helpful. And I think as we go forward with these webinars, if we get some major commonality in the questions that come in after them, we'll bring them up at the beginning of the next webinar. And we have a lot of our audience that tunes in every other week with us. So I think that's really helpful for them. Craig, we're going to move to our main topic today, which is hurricane prep. And I forgot to mention in the intro, we thought we'd do a back-to-back series here this week about preparing for a hurricane. And then next week, we're going to do the recovery, the insurance. We're going to have a public adjuster on as a guest so that if we do get hit, our boards have been coached up on the steps they should be taking. So Craig, were there any more ESA questions before we move on to hurricanes?
Just 2 quick hits. I would say one is the fact that to confirm that the health professional doesn't have to necessarily be licensed in Florida, just has to be a licensed health practitioner. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then 2, they don't have to see the person in person, right? But they have to know them. Can you just clarify that?
Well, it does. It's an interesting nuance, Craig. It does say in person, okay, and they have to have personal knowledge. Yeah. So these people and the law further says that the practitioner cannot be set up just for the sole purpose of generating these letters. So they have to have a real practice, a real mental health care practice. Now, is it telecounseling in person? Personally, I believe that does qualify as in person. We're in person right now talking to each other. Where it's not in person is where you go online, and I've actually checked this out, and all you're doing is filling out a survey, boop, 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 and boom, you never see a person. You're faceless, they're faceless, you're just inputting data, and then the computer spits out a diagnosis. That's not in person.
Okay, good, thanks. That's pretty much what we've had asked about the ESAs, James.
Good. Mariness, we're going to jump into hurricanes, and I'm not going to talk first about disaster recovery plans, but let's put up poll question 2 while we intro this topic with Donna, just so we have the data when we get to that. And Donna, I just had a question that it struck me. I'm trying to now join our 2 topics. So I have an ESA and I have to go to a hurricane shelter. Do you know whether you can bring your ESA? I'm fairly certain you're allowed to bring your service animal, but it just struck me, and I'm catching you off guard here because I never asked you this question before. Do you know whether an ESA can go to a shelter?
I don't know offhand, and it's worth researching. I know that they say constantly you cannot bring pets, but remember, under the eyes of the law, these animals are not considered pets. I would say to anybody out there who does have an ESA, you should check that out with your local shelter and confirm whether or not you have to submit the necessary paperwork. I do not recommend you showing up with, Fifi under your arm and say, this is my ESA. So there is a legal litmus test that you have to meet in order to have this animal qualify as an ESA. By the way, printing out a certificate online saying that your dog is an ESA is absolutely worthless. ESAs have no skills. The only skill they have is they make you feel good. So those certificates are not worth the paper you printed them on.
Okay. Donna, I want to open up the discussion about hurricanes fairly broadly. Our audience is primarily boards of directors. What responsibility does the board or the association led by the board have as it relates to hurricanes?
Well, you have tremendous responsibility, and you've got both legal responsibility and a moral responsibility. I mean, you were elected as a board to do what? What's your main function? To protect the building, life and safety, and property and people. Okay, so there's no way avoiding that. You know, you're on the board. It's a serious job. You do have certain obligations. Now, I'm happy to say that because of those emergency statutory powers we've been talking about, you do have some breathing room here. There are a lot of emotions involved with hurricanes, as we all know, and those are going to be heightened this season because of the pandemic. In years past, Craig and James, I'm sure you guys have seen it too, where people don't want to leave, right? We all feel that way. We'd rather shelter in place. That is going to be even more true right now. As we know, September and October are the busiest hurricane months in Florida. I don't think people are going to be inclined to go into shelters if they're in an evacuation zone with this pandemic still going on. So the statute says that if people don't obey in your building or your community a mandatory evacuation order, the board is insulated from that. So that's the good news. Legally, you are insulated. Now, morally, if you know you've got vulnerable people in the community, what do you do about that? You have obligations to communicate. Personally, I think as a board, the most important thing you can be doing right now, other than photographing your property, date stamping it so we know what the current condition is taking control of who's in the building, who are identifying your most vulnerable residents, and updating emergency contact information for everybody.
Yeah, you know, you kind of jumped around on a few topics there, so let me be a little agile here.
I know, I'm sorry, I do that.
No, it's great, but
we got a lot of territory to cover.
I wanted to kind of bucket, Donna, the responsibility areas that you just described. And I think your point about it's not just illegal, there is a moral obligation here. Craig, you'll remember, and I won't name the name of the property, but we had a high-rise beachfront mandatory evacuation. An elderly lady did not evacuate. She's on the 20th floor. There's no power to the building for days. Well, we knew she was up there. And so, we could rely on the law all we want, saying there's no liability to the association. There's a moral obligation to help. And I'll get into that in a little bit in terms of what we recommend you do. But I think there's the people side, number one, in terms of responsibility. I think you really hit it, that there's a communication responsibility. And what's really important, I'm trying to stop on these takeaways for our boards. Are you certain, as a board, you have the ability to communicate to every one of your owners and residents? Have you established and proven and tested that, yes, you're communicating? Because it's all happens very quickly. It's very fluid. So I would say, a big takeaway from this is leaving and confirming that you've got an official communication path to every owner and resident. And I say owner and resident because you've got renters in your buildings as well. And then
to that point, James, if I could just interject really quickly.
Yeah.
Use more than one communication channel, okay? If the building is, if the unit is rented out, maybe you email the owner, you email the tenant. Maybe for those people who aren't on email, and often we don't have time to be doing regular mail, maybe you print out letters and you slip it under the doors or put it in their mailbox. You have to get the word out in a variety of channels. If you've got a website, for sure put it on the website. As we all know, sometimes websites are not heavily viewed in community associations, but it doesn't hurt. I mean, if you have 3 or 4 different communication channels, this disaster plan and what's going to happen before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm should be blasted out on every communication channel you have, not just one.
Donna, we're going to talk about insurance a little deeper in a minute here, but in terms of responsibility of the board, there's absolutely a responsibility for appropriate insurance, and there's a responsibility that the physical plant, you've done everything possible to prepare it for a storm. So people communicate physical plant, insurance, and then I end with, because I want to go into it, you need to have a disaster recovery plan. We used to call them hurricane plans, Craig, but COVID is a great example of why it really should have a broader definition. And I would like to share with the audience, Mariness, our poll results. I find this very interesting. This is our audience who have written disaster recovery plans and who don't. And so I think this is going to be a huge opportunity, and maybe we can provide some resources, because we've got a significant percentage of our communities that don't have a plan.
Once upon a time, the Florida legislature was going to mandate that all these multifamily buildings have emergency plans. I don't know how they were going to regulate it, perhaps have them mail it in, submit it with their annual report. But that was certainly a discussion point, because it's so important that buildings do have these disaster plans.
So let's talk about a disaster plan. We're in hurricane season now. We have been doing this for a couple of months. I mean, 30 years, but a couple of months this season. I wanted to kind of highlight some of the areas that a plan has. And what we do at Castle is we basically break it down into a people portion of the plan, a property portion of the plan, and then a finance and administration portion, because we're going to talk about it, but insurance policies have huge deductibles, and are we prepared to fund those deductibles? And then we have, so that's kind of 3 categories, but then we have timing, pre-storm activities, during the storm, and after the storm. Everything, all of those 6 buckets need to be addressed in a plan. I want to mention that we have created an app at Castle, because we manage, I think, 375 associations. How do we know that every one of those is ready for the storm? And the way our company is organized, every property has a property manager, but every group of managers has a regional director. And the regional director has an app, and every time their manager checks in with them to say, we have completed the pre-storm checklist, they update the app. And then my brother Rob, who's our partner and our COO, he literally real time on a huge screen in his office, we know exactly which communities have completed their pre-storm checklist in real time. And the other great thing about that is we have a heat map of every one of our properties, and we can actually overlay the storm path with our heat map. So even before it hits, we know where we're going to have to deploy resources. But I say that, number one, because we're quite proud of it, but number two, that's the extent of thought that needs to go into in advance of a storm. It's too late during or after the storm to do the planning. But let's talk about, Craig and Donna, what elements there should be as it relates to these different areas, and specifically timing. We have 96, 72, 48, 24-hour checklists. Sometimes we don't get that much warning, but Donna, what you're thinking on how much time in advance of a pending storm we should be communicating to our owners?
Well, first of all, I want to say your storm prep at Castle sounds amazing, but I believe some of the people listening are not professionally managed. So if they were sitting there thinking, oh my God, we're not doing that, it's not too late for people listening. We're looking out the window, weather's pretty good. It's not too late for you to still take a few of these steps. I don't think this plan can be too comprehensive, James. So, in terms of how far out, I think right now, even now, before the wind even starts blowing, you as a board can put up and tell your residents where you can find the disaster plan. And part of the disaster plan will be the breakdown you just outlined in terms of here's what's going to happen 96 hours before the storm, 72, 48, 24. They need to know how long will our front desk staff be here? How long will our security guards be here, and when will they come back? Do we have a generator for the building? If the building's under a mandatory evacuation order, will the electricity and the elevators, will everything be shut down? After a storm, when will we be able to return to our units, and who makes that decision? By the way, the disaster plan is not just about informing your members what's going to happen. Guess what? The disaster plan should be designed to inform the entire board as to who should be doing what. I teach a board cert class, as to all the other backup attorneys, and I always ask, when you got on the board, did anybody sit you down and tell you what your job was? Specifically, Craig, this is your job. You're the VP. Here's what you're going to be doing. Here's all the contracts. And they always shake their head and say no. So people really get thrown into it. Now, under ordinary circumstances, you'll learn on the job. But when a hurricane comes, particularly if we're looking at a massive hurricane, that's not the time to be learning on the job. Your board, part of that disaster plan needs to be, what are we as a board doing? Do we have specific duties we're going to parse out amongst the different directors? We need to know how are we going to communicate when we're all scattered around the state or even the country? So I think right now that disaster plan can be communicated to everybody, a comprehensive plan. And then as you're describing, James, you feed it out in bits. In terms of what you need to know in the next 96 hours, what do you need to know in the next 72 hours, and so on.
Yeah, so from a calendar perspective, we have our CERT meetings internally in May, and we have an audit on May 31st to make sure all plans have been completed. I think you make up a great point though, Donna. There are some listeners who are self-managed and maybe don't have the benefit of a templated plan that they can customize, but we can certainly help and happy to provide a template for them. Okay, well, I do think though that you can't, just to end off on communication, in fact, Mariness, will you pop up question 3? It's related to communication. And you got to know how you're going to communicate. Our intervals are 96, 72, 48, 24. And I'm not saying that's the right answer. What I'm saying is I don't think you can over communicate with a storm coming.
100% agree.
Yeah. And so I want to also ask about so with COVID, if we thought we're going to have people staying in their homes, even in light of an evacuation order before it, we're going to even have more now. So what should we be doing? I know we may not have a legal obligation, but Craig and Donna, what do you think we should be doing in terms of almost inventorying who's in the building when we leave? Because ultimately, if it's a hurricane, it's going to hit, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But for the most part, we've left the building.
Well, Craig, that's a good question for you to start with, and then I'll.
Well, I think it's really important. I mean, the reality is, you spoke of the moral obligation. The reality is, it's especially in condos, it's really a sense of community, almost an extended family. So you do have an obligation, I believe, to, well, not legal, to really know people, know what they need, know how to help them. And you can't do that if you don't know who they are and where they are. I know we have in our software, you can toggle whether you're here or not. So we know, straight out whether you're in the building. When you leave, you kind of go on the app and you say, I'm not here anymore. I'm in Michigan, enjoying the summer weather. But I think it's hugely important. And we spend a lot of time knowing who's in the building and who's not.
So this is one of the communications we send out. We say, look, if you are going to remain in the building, then we want to know. And we will actually give that list to the police department of that area because, you know, that, I guess it's first responders that ultimately become responsible. And by the way, we've talked to a lot of the police and first responders, and their comment to us is, if you're staying in the building in an evacuation zone, you're putting us at risk, the first responders, because they shouldn't have to go in there because you weren't supposed to be there. So if you're looking for reasons to compel your residents, there's a good one.
Well, I will tell you, actually more than one of my communities in Irma sent out next of kin notifications before, saying, if you're going to stay, we'd like you to fill out and tell us who your next of kin are. If you don't make it, who you want allowed in your unit and who don't. By the way, in that community, everybody evacuated. But it was a legitimate, seriously, people do need to know what the risks are. It's one thing just to say you're staying at your own risk. It's another thing to say, if you are staying, you will not have electricity. We are shutting down the building. The elevator will be stuck at the highest floor. You will have to walk down 12 flights if you're staying, you know. So it's one thing, I would make it abundantly clear. This is where that disaster plan comes in, James, which is, what does this look like? There won't be security. There won't be any employees here. There won't be electricity. You won't be able to use an elevator. And by the way, here's a next of kin form. Can you please fill that out? I will tell you, I'm not suggesting that everybody do that, but when a client suggested it, I thought, that's an interesting take.
We have some of our audience members that are in big, beautiful 55 plus HOAs and all over the state, but you know, we have a real concentration of them in southwest Palm Beach County. And they have these amazing clubhouses that for the most part have been closed for the last 3 or 4 months. What are the legal implications of making the clubhouse available for shelter, Donna, in these large HOAs?
It's a great question. I actually had a large master association for a retirement community where that community was without power for 10 days after the storm. The clubhouse did have power, so they opened it up. They said, you can come in, we're going to allow you to bring some medications so we can keep your medications cold. I thought it was the right thing to do. They did ask, they said, is there any legal liability? I didn't see any, really, as long as the building was sound and safe for people to enter into. Now, they did not have people sheltering inside during the storm, and that would have potential risk involved. So I would feel better not turning that into a shelter. There are county and city shelters that serve that purpose. But certainly post-storm, if you've got a clubhouse that can serve as a distribution center for water, to store medicine. Some communities even have CERT teams that come and help, because often EMTs cannot get in. There's just too much demand post-storm. But I wouldn't do that unless you've gone through the proper CERT training.
Yeah, by the way, another takeaway, especially for our self-managed communities, having a CERT team is a good idea. Emergency response team. Okay, Craig, I'm going to check in with you after we look at this poll, but in case there's some burning questions out there, here's the poll results of whether we have contact information. It's for the most part encouraging, but as I pile up my list of takeaways here, this is one, I think, for our 22 communities that don't have it. That would be something I'd go and act on right now. Craig, how are we doing on our questions?
We're doing well. The one question I wanted to ask you about with respect to kind of it is called a disaster recovery plan. Part of that plan is the preparing for the storm. And I think, Donna, if you are in a building and you have hurricane shutters and you don't really have a plan, so the shutters don't get shut in the storm and it gets damaged, do you have any more obligation? Like, is the insurance company going to look at you and say you didn't mitigate, you know, you're on your own? Is there any risk of that?
That's a great question, and one of my points here, which is harden your building. So when you started out with the question, what is the board's obligation? Well, one of your overarching obligations is to ensure that your building is watertight going into the storm. So if you know that you have owners with windows that are leaking or failing, you need to take care of that now. And that may be, as a board, you say, let's put this to a membership vote. In a condo, if we're dealing with a condo, let's put this to a membership vote and see if the majority of the members want us to install shutters or impact glass. Obviously a lot of construction was delayed during COVID, but right now it's incredibly important that if you've got delayed maintenance or repair projects related to either the roof or the windows, that you get those taken care of, because a couple things are going to happen. As you said, Craig, the building's not going to be watertight, which means more damage can be sustained, which means that it leaves the board open to a possible negligence claim, failure to maintain the building. And the other thing that's going to happen, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, James, when the adjuster comes on, is that it's going to potentially derail an otherwise legitimate property damage claim, because the insurance company is going to say, this isn't storm damage, this is pre-existing damage that you failed to repair. So it's important right now that you as a board decide, do we have sufficient impact from a storm in terms of impact glass, or are all our windows functioning, and do we have shutters? Does everybody have a shutter? And the best way to deal with that is not to chase your owners to put up shutters, it's to have the board install shutters. And the statute allows you to do that.
Excellent. So a couple more steps. Let's have a poll question for Mariness. There's two areas, Craig, I'd like you to comment on. One is pre-negotiating contracts with, management, pool, restoration firm, landscaping. And the second is, these are huge deductibles on these policies, normally beyond the liquid resources of an association. What are a couple of the strategies for having available funds to pay a deductible in case you're the unfortunate community that gets hit straight on?
I'd say, so starting from number one, you have these critical vendors that you're going to need to manage after the storm. In water extraction, landscapers would be two for sure. And you really need, guys, everybody in the state, all 46,000 condos potentially could need those resources. So, we advocate, and actually we require our communities to go and negotiate the deal with those people. Make sure you have their cell phone, make sure you're on their response list, because otherwise you're with the masses. So, key vendors, landscapers for HOAs, probably water extraction for condos, absolutely have those contracts, have them know your building, have them know your community, know the plan. So huge part of your disaster recovery plan is having those relationships. With respect to funding, my favorite topic, you have kind of three sources. Number one, hopefully, first of all, the amount of your deductible. That's important, because knowing it's a big number doesn't really help you. Knowing it's $623,000, at least you have a target. So know what the amount is. Figure out, some associations have enough surplus to fund that, deductible. Some don't, and Donna will ask you in a second about reserves, but some associations that we've worked with have emergency lines of credit. So we've said, okay, and they're really easy to get if you have kind of good financial records, but there's a half a dozen banks that are in this business that write emergency lines of credits. This is the amount we need. If there's a deductible, it's sitting out there to draw on in the event you have a loss. By the way, not all claims get you to the deductible. Like, there's substantial claims that don't get the deductible, you still got to figure out how to pay for. And then I think the last one probably is the potential. Some associations are reserving for hurricane deductibles, and some just have a bucket of money out there. And Don, I think I would ask you the question, can I use my reserves in an emergency to fund a hurricane deductible?
Well, this is a lot to discuss. Insurance is key, and we don't have much time left, but I will tell you this. There's a big difference between the answer to that question, if you're in a condominium or a cooperative or a homeowners association. Let's start with homeowners association. Homeowners association reserves are handled a little bit differently. They are not required by statute to have certain statutory reserves. In an HOA, you are required to follow the condo type reserve protocol if your developer created the community with reserves, which most HOA developers do not, or if your owners voted on and implemented a reserve for a particular component, let's say the clubhouse or the guard gate. So in the vast majority of Florida HOAs, they don't have those constraints. They may have what they call a reserve. It's more a rainy day fund. It's a contingency reserve. In that case, those HOA boards have more flexibility about tapping into those reserves to fund uninsured losses, to remove debris, things to dry in, dry out the clubhouse, or even sometimes in HOAs, they're responsible for roofs. That being said, the statutory emergency powers do not allow boards to tap into reserves. What the statutory emergency powers do is they allow boards to pass a special assessment without a membership vote. So even if your governing documents say you need a membership vote if you are passing a special assessment over a certain dollar amount, if we get hit by a hurricane, the governor's going to declare a state of emergency. Those emergency powers are going to come back into existence. And that's where you can pass a special assessment without a membership vote. You can also borrow money without a membership vote. So even if your documents otherwise say you cannot borrow money as a board without a membership vote, if the emergency powers come into play, you can do it. But don't touch reserves in a condo or a co-op unless you follow the statutory protocol, which is 75% approval of your members. I did want to touch, I mean, there's so much in what you were saying, Craig, to unpack. If you've pre-negotiated pricing for your landscaper, your pool guy, your roofer, that goes into the emergency plan. Let people know, hey, we've pre-negotiated these prices, and here's what we're expecting in terms of debris removal or having somebody come out. But here's what's also important is letting your members know ahead of time what they're responsible for in terms of post-casualty repairs and what the board's responsible for, because there's a lot of confusion. For those people who put up that beautiful Florida room on their balcony, right? You guys have that, right? You got clients who filled it in. That's an upgrade. Guess what the statute says? If your Florida room gets blown out, you as an owner are paying to repair or replace the Florida room, not the board. So it's incredible. I mean, we could talk about that for 40 minutes, the insurance nuances here.
Donna, because of time, I'm going to keep us going, but Marinette, please share the results of question 4. And that is good. I mean, I'm quite pleased with that. I'm going to just hit some kind of lightning round points that I don't think we're going to have a lot of time to debate, but I think are important for this episode. Number one, a big question we get is when will staff leave the building? It doesn't matter whether you're professional or self-managed. And you do have to make that part of your plan and communicate it so that the owners know there's not going to be any staff there. And generally, I think you'll see across most properties, what our concern is getting the team home safely. And kind of a rule of thumb is as soon as winds go to 35 miles an hour, it becomes unsafe. So that's it's not so much time necessarily as circumstances. So there's one. 2, will anyone stay in the building or in our community? Our workers' comp carriers will say absolutely not. I will tell you, we as a company have made a decision to take some workers' comp risk because number one, it's great to have someone in the building to deal with whatever comes up. And number 2, we don't require anybody to, but we have a lot of our building maintenance supervisors who have literally told us, I'm safer in my building than I am in my home. So it's not that you can't have someone in the building, but you really can't require them to be there. And same with security. So there's a lot of times, even during the storm, in a lot of our communities, we'll still have one maintenance person and one security. We don't generally shut the power off because that's what we have if it does go off, I mean, you need your generator to run certain life safety systems. One quick sidebar, my brother was reminding me, don't just, make sure you've fully load tested your generator. It's one thing for it to do its weekly exercise, but once a year, you should do a full load test to make sure it can respond accordingly. And then finally, on that lightning round of things you should consider, if you are in an elevated building, those elevators will be shut down, and they will be shut down off of the ground floor so that they don't get subject to water. But there will be no elevators in a hurricane, which we get that question.
James, can I make one quick point on generators? So
Yeah.
Generators are a big, there's a distinction between generators in an HOA and generators, whole building generators for condos and co-ops. Now, I have some HOA clients that really don't like generators, but in a single family home community, part of that disaster plan is, what type of generators? Will you have an issue if you say we don't want generators because we don't like the noise it produces? Some communities, you really do have to talk to council, because saying flat out we're not going to allow generators, or we only want the whole house very expensive generators, maybe putting certain people at risk. So it is a different analysis in terms of generators between the condos and HOAs. And as I think I just read this morning, a lot of the fatalities in Laura were what? Tied to generator risk. That's where the loss of
the
life.
other thing I think everyone should know, generally, a generator does not power everything. It's there to make sure the building can operate at a minimal level. Okay, as usual, a team, we're running short on time. A couple of points, and I think it'll tee us up nicely for next week when we have the adjuster here. Next week, we're going to assume the storm came through and we've got some problems with our community, and what do we do about it? But Donna, one of the things that I skipped over here was we talked about insurance as it relates to deductibles, but we haven't talked about reviewing your policy with your agent to make sure it's got all the coverages currently available, because that changes. 2, if you haven't documented by photo and video the assets of the community, that's a problem. And 3, same with your documents. If you're professionally managed, normally all of your documents are digitized and have your management company has a plan to keep those safe. But if you're self-managed, you have a responsibility to keep those documents safe. And then, so Donna, you had mentioned law and ordinance coverage as an example, but maybe just comment on photo, video, meet with your agent before the storm.
Yeah. This gets back again to your initial question is, what are our board's responsibilities? Well, one of the responsibility is, has the board procured adequate insurance for the community? You need to look to 2 things, the statute and your governing documents. Some governing documents are very specific about the type of insurance you have to be carrying. And occasionally I come across clients who are not carrying all the required coverage under their documents. That is a textbook potential negligence claim. If your documents require you, or the statutes requiring you to carry certain coverage and you haven't, you are putting yourself at risk for a liability.
Donna, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you. I forgot to ask the last 2 questions. Marinus, put them up at the same time before we lose our crew, because it's relevant to what you're saying, Donna. But sorry, go ahead.
Right, and have you done everything to safeguard your claim? So that gets back to, have you delayed maintenance and repair projects where now you are jeopardizing the claim if you get hit in 3 weeks, and they can say, well, these windows have been failing for years and you haven't maintained them. That's another obligation. Talk to your agent, because now the statute does not require you to have law and ordinance coverage. What is law and ordinance coverage? It means if your building needs repairs or rebuilding, you can rebuild to current code. Without that coverage, you may have to come out of pocket millions of dollars to bring the building and the renovations and repairs up to code. That's where law and ordinance coverage comes in. But some governing documents require you to have law and ordinance. So this really is a joint conversation with both your insurance agent, here's what I got, but also experienced insurance counsel will be able to tell you, hey, here's what you've got, but here's where it deviates from what your statutory requirements are and perhaps your documentary requirements. And you need to know that now.
Okay, so I'm going to work. I want to end with kind of some of the chunks and takeaways I hope our audience will consider in their own community, starting with sharing the polling results there, Marinez. You will see that we have a large percentage of our audience that haven't yet documented what they need to. So there's a great takeaway. 2, it's clear that a lot of our communities don't have a plan to how to fund this. And that's, by the way, there's no judgment there. This is a toughie. You know, how can you keep liquid assets available for the rainy day that may not happen in 20 years? But at least think about it and have a plan for that. 3, I think, Donna, your point about making a distinction and communicating to your owners what they're responsible for and what the association ahead of time is a key takeaway here. Pre-negotiate your key contracts. It number 1 gets you to the top of the queue, and number 2, they pre-negotiate like per unit rates, so you don't have to negotiate after the storm. The next one was Donna used the term harden your building. Do the inspection and make sure we've done all we can for our community before the storm comes. Probably the most important is have a plan. We had a significant percentage of our audience say that they did not. So I think that's super important. And moving back, ESAs are not a pet. And we're gonna put up your blog, Donna, so that they can have some follow-up on that. And then finally, state of emergency is on September 6th, the potential end of that. And that's before our next episode, which is going to be on the 16th. So think about that, boards. If it doesn't get renewed, what are you going to do? And then finally, we're going to be back here on the 16th, and we're going to do the other side of the storm. The storm's hit, our community has some damage. What do we do about it? So Donna and Craig, with that, by the way, did we share the last video polling results? Marinez? Okay, maybe I didn't, sorry. So there's the results for the audience. And Donna, Craig, any last words? I know we're 5 minutes over time, but there's just so much great data here.
One really quick piece of practical advice. I'm looking at the photos. Fewer than half have properly documented the current state of their property. That's going to be a problem. In terms of roofs, I know a lot of communities now are renting out drones to take pictures of the roof. Otherwise, I don't know how you're getting up there. But this is really important. Document your pre-storm condition of your property. Have that conversation with your agent. You may be shocked to find out that you have a per building deductible. I have one community with 29 deductibles. They were not aware that it was going to be that expensive. You may not have the coverage you think, but even more importantly, your owners may be relying on the board to pay for things post-storm that are not the board's obligation. And this is where all the problems come out after the fact. So really important to work with counsel and your agent and educate your members, because some of them, guess what, folks? They don't have insurance coverage. So they're looking to the board to cover all this stuff. And be safe.
I think
wow, I'm like, I'm working up a sweat. It's so much information in so short a time. So we do this because we think we're adding value. I want to thank Donna and Craig for adding your expertise. I know our audience is appreciative. The only challenge is they're probably leaving here scratching their head with all the work that's left to do, but we hope it helps. We're going to see you in 2 weeks, September 16th, same time, same place. And we're going to tell you a little bit about what you do if you do get hit by a storm. So we're grateful for all you're doing for the communities, and we'll talk to you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Take care,
Bye, everybody.